Hey everyone, it is Chris, and today we are going to talk about rules exploits by players and, what constitutes a rules exploit and what you should do about them as a DM. My original plan was actually I was going to be doing a build video. In fact, I have 3 build videos planned because I'm currently involved in 2 campaigns, have been for a few months now. And I am also involved in kind of a campaign. That's a bunch of one-shots that are sequential, and we go up a level each time. And so I have 3 different builds that I'm using for these, using the new rules, using only the new rules, and I want to share them with you. But I just released a video where I was talking about what I call the launcher strategy. And the launcher strategy is basically use the crusher feat and throw somebody in the air, and then you use your pushing abilities to send them flying, and then they fall and they take damage and land prone. And I had a comment on that video in early release, and I bet you I've had more comments since where I've been told that this is a rules exploit. And the reasoning is that physically, it's probably just not possible to be launching somebody. I mean, 10 feet in the air is one thing, 40 feet in the air is another thing. With your Warhammer, right? It's kind of ridiculous. And so we have a section in the Dungeon Master's Guide that kind of, talks about these kinds of things. So I want to talk about those rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide today. And I'm going to tell you what I like about them, what I don't like about them. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we call the rule of cool. That's from Matt Mercer. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, my own personal experience as a DM dealing with player exploits. Okay, so here's the section in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Should be able to see it up on your screen. And it says, players exploiting the rules. Some players enjoy poring over the D&D rules and looking for optimal combinations. I am one of them. This kind of optimizing is part of the game, but it can cross a line, which it can, into being exploitative, interfering with everyone else's fun. Setting clear expectations is essential when dealing with this kind of rules exploitation. Bear these principles in mind. And we have 4 principles listed here. The first is rules aren't physics. The rules of the game are meant to provide a fun game experience, not to describe the laws of physics in worlds of D&D, let alone the real world. Don't let players argue that a bucket brigade of ordinary people can accelerate a spear to light speed all using the ready action to pass a spear to the next person in line. This example they're giving is a real example. This is called the peasant railgun. You can Google it if you want. The ready action facilitates heroic action. It doesn't define the physical limitations of what can happen in a 6-second combat round. So basically they're saying don't let your players tell you that the peasant railgun is, something that should be allowed in your game. Second, the game is not an economy. The rules of the game aren't intended to model a realistic economy, and players who look for loopholes that let them generate infinite wealth using combinations of spells are exploiting the rules. I've talked about this in my videos before. Feel a little bit targeted there, but I get it. I get it. If we can just generate infinite wealth because they made the fabricate spell and I figure out a way to use the fabricate spell to make infinite amounts of money, that doesn't mean it's good for my game or that the DM should allow it. Number 3, combat is for enemies. Some rules apply only during combat or while a character is acting in initiative order. Don't let players attack each other or helpless creatures to activate those rules. They don't specifically call it out, but the term we generally use for this in the optimization community is bag of rats. And the idea is that there are certain kind of features that are advantageous to use outside of combat, even though by the rules they can only be used inside of combat. Therefore, if you carried around a bag of live rats, the idea would be that you could use your combat abilities on the rats, thus generating initiative and using your abilities. And I generally don't like features that allow you to do the bag of rat strategy, but I do think as a DM, it's just totally reasonable for you to say, I'm not calling for initiative just because you attacked a rat. But that's what we call bag of rats. And finally, rules rely on good faith interpretation. The rules assume that everyone is reading and interpreting the rules, has the interests of the group's fun at heart, and is reading the rules in that light. And then it goes on to say outlining these principles can help hold players' exploits at bay. If a player persistently tries to twist the rules of the game, have a conversation with that player outside the game and ask them to stop. So, if we look at these various priorities, the rules aren't physics and all the other ones as well, I would say they all boil down to the one priority that you actually have. And the one priority you actually have is that you need to have a shared understanding of how the rules will work in your game between the DM and all the players. Everyone needs to be kind of on the same page as to how you're going to interpret rules, and if you are, it solves all exploits. Because it could be that you are a exploit is cool table, and if you are, then you should use exploits because you and your table have determined they're fun and it's great. There's nothing wrong with that. There's no wrong way to play if everyone's having a good time. The only wrong way to play is if not everyone's having a good time, then something's wrong, and that's something that should be addressed. Now, this can include, but is not necessarily limited to, situations where the rules just don't make sense for a particular situation. And when that happens, we would expect our DM to make a common sense ruling that may adjust the rules in that one circumstance so that, the rules and how things are working fit our personal expectation of how the make-believe world we're all playing in works. And as players, I think it's important to keep in mind that sometimes the rules tell us we can do something. Sometimes the rules don't explicitly forbid us from doing something. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's okay for our table, particularly if our reading is not intuitive, because bad faith reading and unintuitive combinations are not necessarily the same thing. So, to reference my previous video of the launcher again, it is definitely true that if you have a medium-sized character and you hit a large-sized creature that presumably is a lot heavier than you with a warhammer, it is not realistic to shove them 10 feet into the air. It is most definitely not realistic to launch them 40 feet into the air. On the other hand, neither is it realistic for us to push them 40 feet along the ground away from us. I mean, every action has an equal and opposite reaction, so if we weigh less than the enemy and the enemy is moving 10 feet away from us, because of our strike, we should be moving more than 10 feet away from them in the other direction. But that's not how the rules work. So it's not that one of these is realistic and one of these is not realistic. Neither are realistic. Neither obey the laws of physics. The difference is that usually when we read the rules, we are assuming a two-dimensional battle map. There are exceptions, but usually that is the case. So when we read something like the push mastery, we're assuming that enemy is being pushed along the ground. That is the intuitive reading. If we apply Crusher and then look at how the angle affects the direction of their being pushed, and suddenly we're involving 3 dimensions, that's less intuitive. It's just not the obvious conclusion that somebody's going to come to on a first reading. So those kinds of things, when you have something unintuitive, you do need to check and make sure that it's going to fit the game that you, the other players, and the DM want to play. And that kind of brings me to my issue with these 4 priorities, and that is that they're all actually pretty vague and don't necessarily always apply. Just because the rules are not following the laws of physics doesn't mean we shouldn't use them. The push mastery is fun. Of course, we're going to keep it in the game. So sometimes the rules do have us do things that are not physically possible, and we just ignore it. And that's okay. And this applies to the game is not an economy as well. Because, real world economies have things like inflation and scarcity and supply and demand and sales taxes and all kinds of complications. And we just there's no way we're going to introduce all of that into our games. Now, we can introduce some of them into our games. You know, it's perfectly reasonable for a DM to say, you know, where you are right now, this item is scarce, so it's going to cost more, sure. But the full complexities of real-world economy will never apply to a game, and we wouldn't want to. So that also doesn't always apply either. Then we have combat is for enemies. This tells us that, you know, if there's going to be initiative order, then we need to be in combat, and that combat needs to be against an enemy, not attacking another player or a helpless creature. And that particular example is fair enough, except as a DM, I have seen other DMs many times call for initiative when we're not in combat with enemies. You know, it could be, for example, you know, you're in a town and there's some kind of natural disaster happening and you need to save the various people of the town, and time is important. So we're going to use initiative and track turns, and it helps us keep track of how much everyone is doing. And that can work great. So sometimes combat isn't for enemies. And finally, the rules rely on good faith interpretation. And absolutely, there are cases where you can read a rule and it's just really clear how it's supposed to work and everyone's going to agree on it, and that is a good faith interpretation. And there are absolutely cases where there are really bad faith interpretations of rules, usually involving, oh, it doesn't say I can't do this, and, you know, then some ridiculous exploit is suggested. Obviously, that's a bad faith interpretation, and so there are these extremes. But there is a whole lot of gray area in the middle. Not everything is an extreme. Most things aren't. So you can read a rule and somebody else can read a rule and you think it will interact this one way and they think it'll interact that other way. That doesn't mean anyone is necessarily in reading in bad faith, or maybe they're reading a tiny bit in bad faith, and that's different than reading just blatantly in bad faith. This is complicated and it's subjective. You know, what is good faith interpretation is definitely subjective. So I don't think this is universally applicable either, or easy to apply, at least in your games. So I have some issues with these rules as they're written, or these suggestions to the DM as they're written. On the other hand, as much as I've been criticizing them, I'm glad they're here. Because one thing I hate to see, and I have seen it unfortunately, is a DM makes a ruling and then some player just steamrolls them into accepting some kind of exploit that isn't fun for the DM. And that's terrible to see, and I've seen it. And so what I do like about these rules is they do tell the DM they don't always have to say yes. And I think that's really important to say, because that you have people like Matt Mercer. So Matt Mercer, of course, is the DM for Critical Role, and he goes by this rule of cool. And basically, a rule of cool is that if something is cool, you allow it, right? And then you have this cool thing in your game. And I think that is a terrible rule. I mean, it might be a good rule if you are a DM playing with players who are all professional entertainers and you're creating content for the purpose of entertainment. And so you're all on the same page that way. And so if somebody suggests something, everyone's going to think it's cool. Great. Then it works for that. But as a general rule to suggest to DMs out there, I don't think it's good at all. Because the thing is, what's cool? You know, somebody comes up with an exploit, you should allow it because it's cool. Well, who says it's cool? You say it's cool, but do I agree it's cool? Is cool a measurement of any kind that we can like objectively measure? It's no, it means nothing. You know, what you think is cool and what I think is cool are probably very different things. It's a dumb rule because, you know, it gives the player the idea that if they come up with something that they think is cool, the DM should allow it because rule of cool. And I just don't think that's a good way to play. So I want to finish this video by discussing what I, as a DM, would recommend to other DMs in terms of dealing with possible player exploits. And I say possible because I do think what is an exploit and what isn't is very subjective. The real question is, do you want it in your game? And I think there are 3 questions you can ask yourself, and if you can give yourself an honest answer to these questions, you'll know whether you want it in your game or not. And these are in order of the way I personally prioritize them. And the first question I always ask myself is it overpowered? Because if something is really overpowered, even if it makes sense, even if the rules explicitly allow it, even if I think it's how it's intended to work, if I think something is incredibly overpowered, then it can take over the game. And I don't think that's good. So the very first thing I'm thinking of is the health of my game. And the health of my game suffers if I just allow things that are overpowered to take over. This is why I house rule conjure minor elementals. Number 2, does it make sense? This is actually less important to me than whether it's overpowered, but it is still important. If something just doesn't make any sense, like the monk who, runs up the wall and drops a guy a little bit and then runs him up again and drops him again and runs him up again and drops him again and over and over and over again like a whirlwind, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So whether or not it's overpowered, I just don't want people doing that in my games. I don't want a bunch of weird rules interactions that don't make sense, whether or not they're overpowered, because it's immersion breaking. And then the third thing is that how I think it's intended to work? What did the designers intend? If we, read sage advice, this tells us what the designers intended for the rules that we have questions about. And that can be very helpful and can be a good guide. I don't think it's the most important thing. Whether it's overpowered is more important. I definitely think that conjure minor elementals is intended to work as it's written, but I just think their intentions are wrong. And sometimes things don't make sense, and I'm pretty sure they're intended to work that way regardless. It's just there's an interaction maybe they didn't consider. And so the intentions of the designers I do think are important. I do consider them, but they are the lowest on my list of priorities. And those are the only 3 things I look at. Is it overpowered? Does it make sense? Do I think that's how it's intended to work? And based on my answer to those 3 questions, I can come up with one of 3 answers. The first answer possible is yes, you can do it. I don't think it's too overpowered. Makes enough sense to me that I will still think it's fun. And I probably think the designers intended it, or something like that. Maybe it's just the designers didn't intend it, but I'm okay with it, and I don't think it's overpowered. That might be enough for me to say, yes, you can do it. Second possibility is I say, no, you can't. And, this does happen. We have, a lot of content out in the internet right now of people looking at different ways to exploit the rules, and then you have a player kind of dump it on you, and you think, I just don't want this in my game. No, you can't do that. And the third possibility is I say, yes, you can do it once. And basically, okay, in this situation, we'll let you do this for fun, but it's not something I want in my game regularly. So let's just do it, have your fun, let's move on. And that is often where I end up with these kinds of situations is, yeah, you go ahead, you do it once, and if it's fun for you, great. But we're not going to be doing it all the time. And so that's how I make my decisions as to what exploits to allow or what exploits to not allow, and what even qualifies as an exploit. Does it matter if it's an exploit? Conjure minor elementals upcasting isn't an exploit. It's just how the spell works. But, you have to make a decision whether to allow something or not. And those are the 3 priorities I tend to look at. Now, I want to finish up by saying that I do this job full time, and I'm only able to do it because of the support of patrons. So I want to thank some of my patrons today. These are Thaumaturge level patrons. So thank you to Airhead and Alex R, Arden, Bloody Nine, Atherazone, Brian, Chris C, Corell, Dank Train, Dewey Cheatham and Howe, Douglas Reynolds, Eden the DM, Elliot, Aaron, Eric Wasserman, FBKO5, Gar, Gishlife, Henry Malinowski, Athadis, Heisenberger, Jay Gemmel, James Makla, James Sprague, Jiruru, John Matera, Jonathan Zucker, Justin Times, Mark D, Math Guy Dave, Mr. Brett, Mikeanoid, PCZ, Quicksilver HG80, Ramen Goblin, Samwise Gam G, Scott Parsons, Sarek Steel Eye, Tim Grabafik, and William Whittles. Thank you all so much. And until next time, I am going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.